The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Vicki Kobliner is a registered dietitian and the owner of Whole Care Nutrition. She practices a functional nutrition approach to help the body heal itself and has extensive experience using various diet modalities to help children with autism and related disorders. Vicki works with infants, children, and adults with chronic illnesses, digestive disorders, food allergies, ADHD, and autism, and provides fertility and prenatal nutrition counseling. She is a contributing author to A Compromised Generation, the Epidemic of Chronic Illness in America's Children.
Thanks so much, Denise. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So today's topic is selecting supplements, know the source. And I get this question so often from my clients that I felt it was something really, really important to address, and I suggested this topic because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of confusion, and so I'm hoping that I can help clarify how people evaluate supplements and understand which ones might be good, the best choices, the not so ideal choices, both in terms of their quality and their efficacy and all the other things that go around ordering and even buying supplements. So my objectives in terms of this conversation are to hope that when we're done you understand existing regulations and protections that exist in regard to dietary supplements. I hope you can identify factors which affect supplement quality so you know what to look for when you're choosing them, to be able to evaluate label claims, knowing the appropriate form of the nutrient or the botanical the way you would want to buy it, and by form I don't necessarily mean tablet or capsule, although that's an option as well, but in terms of the various compounds and what they might be complexed with. I hope you can learn about the interactions and depletions that can occur when you combine or when you have certain medication and supplement interactions, and knowing the appropriate dosing and scheduling so that you get the most effect from the supplements that you use. So I thought this was funny. I've seen this before, some of you may have as well, but it really speaks a lot to kind of where we are nowadays in terms of dietary supplementation. So we start with 2000 BC when we would say, here, eat this root. And then all of a sudden that root is heathen. Here, say this prayer. That prayer is superstition. Here, drink this potion. In the 1940s, that potion is snake oil. Here, swallow this pill. That pill is ineffective. Here, take this antibiotic. And finally, where we are today, that antibiotic is artificial. Here, eat this root. So the question is we have supplements from the other things we've been taking to try to heal ourselves over the centuries, lots of different questions. And what we really rely on to answer those questions is what we call evidence-based research. Now, the thing that's interesting about evidence-based research, though, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is, but when it comes to integrative research or integrative healing modalities, there really should be a different mindset, and it's one that many people in the integrative community are thinking about, which is that Western research standards, the typical conventional standards that we generally use, require us to test one thing at a time in isolation so we can identify if that specific thing had the effect that we were hoping for. We also look for these double-blind placebo-controlled studies, which are a very good gold standard. It means that neither the person who's doing the study nor the person who's having the study done to them is aware of what actually is the placebo versus the actual item that they're taking or the actual compound. And so the assessment of its function is really objective because no one is subjectively deciding, well, I know he's taking the active compound, so he must be responding to it. The problem is that in reality, we don't take any of these supplements in isolation. When we eat them in food or when we take them as a supplement, they're complexing with many other things that are going on both in our bodies and what we're eating and all kinds of other combinations. We may be taking a multivitamin, so we don't know whether it's one specific item in that multivitamin that's having the effect. Things in the human body, things don't occur in isolation. So Western research standards are something that we really want to reevaluate, and we really are pushing to consider more integrative systems approach where we look at complexes and how those complexes affect all the body systems. We also have to, in integrative approaches, we also have the experience and the benefit of having generations, centuries of traditional cultures and their historic use of many things like botanicals, which may not have been tested as well as some medications because there's no financial gain for many people to do that, but we know that there's wonderful history behind them. We also want to be able to consider the best available evidence, which means what we have available, and evaluate that relative risk versus efficacy. So if there's very little relative risk to trying a supplement or trying an herb, it may be worth it even if we don't have as deep a level of data as we would like to prove its efficacy. And also, experienced clinicians incorporate their practice-based evidence. When they have experience with something, they tend to incorporate that into their modalities. So traditional evidence-based grading systems generally run from kind of A to F. A being a very strong, positive scientific, classical scientific evidence, down to F, which is a strong negative scientific evidence, is something you do not want to use. You know, this is the standard definition of dietary supplements. Products intended to supplement the diet that contain at least one dietary ingredient to include vitamins, minerals, herbs or other botanicals, amino acids, and substances such as enzymes, organ tissue, glandulars, and metabolites. Those are the things that are considered to be dietary supplements. They are taken by mouth. And they can be any oral form, including tablets, capsules, soft gels, gel caps, liquids, powders, bars, but they are not things like transdermals, injectables, sub-Q, things like that. That is not considered a standard dietary supplement, although very often we do include them in the melting pot of what we're utilizing. So the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994 laid down some parameters for what could and could not be controlled in regard to dietary supplements. So they limited impediments to marketing and promoting dietary supplements. They allowed more marketing. They also provided for greater availability to consumers. And they also increased and enhanced information that was available to the consumers. Now, that's a really great thing, but in the absence of effective regulation, it also means that there's a really, really wide variety in the level of quality that people can get in their supplements. And that's a really important thing to understand, because right now the Food and Drug Administration has regulatory control over dietary supplements, but they do not test them themselves. They leave it to the manufacturers to test them. And those manufacturers need to be honorable and honest in terms of what they're putting into their supplements, or you're going to get a supplement that is not of particularly good quality. So on the one hand, the lack of regulation is really great because it means we have much greater access to the items we need, but we also have to be really wise about what we choose. So as part of this Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, we do allow some things you should know. We allow for product labeling claims, as long as it does not diagnose, prevent, treat, or cure a specific disease, which is why you often see on the labels things that says this will support a healthy heart, as opposed to this will, help your cardiovascular disease. And we'll talk a little bit more about those statements. But that's why sometimes people see statements they think are kind of odd or don't really understand why they're there, or they're not more specific. They are not allowed to be more specific than that. The statement must be truthful and not misleading, but there is no review or approval process by the FDA. So again, it's a gray area where if someone does the wrong thing, they may be taken to task for it, they may be, investigated for it, but the FDA is not overseeing it as they're done. And again, supplements are no longer regulated as foods, so they don't have those pre-market safety evaluations. So it is a real kind of Wild West out there in terms of what you can get and the quality of them. So let's talk a little bit more about those health claims. They describe a relationship between a substance and a disease condition. So the FDA doesn't approve those, but they have to be notified when one is used. A qualified health claim is something that is based on emerging scientific evidence. That has to be approved by the FDA. And structure function claims are the most common ones you'll see. And again, they don't claim to prevent a disease or cure a disease, but they do discuss some sort of physiological effect. So again, you might see something like it increases blood flow to the heart, but it's not going to say prevents heart disease. Or promotes, in terms of cranberry, promotes urinary tract health. It's not going to say prevents urinary tract infections. So sometimes we can infer things about these products that are not specifically stated, but we also want to be careful. The reason they're not allowed to say those things is because sometimes the evidence is not there to absolutely back it up. So let's talk a little bit about what makes a good supplement. The first thing it has to be, in my mind, is free of contamination, because no matter how wonderful a supplement may be in theory, if it's contaminated, it's going to be a problem. We also have to make sure that it contains the ingredients on the label, and you may be surprised at how often supplements do not contain what they say on the label. They may have too much of something, too little of something, or be completely missing an ingredient. It should be an effective form of the ingredient. So if we know that, for example, niacinamide is good for something, we want to make sure that niacinamide is the form we're using for that disorder. We want to make sure the dosage is safe and efficacious, that it is hypoallergenic, it's free of common allergens, well absorbed, trackable, and follows good manufacturing practices. And I will discuss this a little more, all of these things. So again, although I am obviously a big proponent of using supplements effectively and efficiently, I am also very, very cautious, and I do encourage people to be careful. So buyer beware here. Just understand there is no regulatory control or pre-market testing. Marketing advertisements can be misleading and deceptive. Effective claims may not be credible, and the concentration and quality of active ingredients can differ from product to product, so you really want to make sure that you're comfortable with the brands you buy and the people who produce them. So this is one study that was done a number of years ago, actually, that looked at 12 brands, and this was for a steroid combination. But 11 out of 12 contained either less than 90% or more than 100% of the amounts listed on the label. 5 out of 12 contained at least one ingredient that wasn't even listed, and 2 were missing an ingredient that was listed. So when we think about that, it tells us that the quality of supplements is very, very variable, and there are no regulations in place to really absolutely control that. This was another study of 240 supplements. These were steroids and prohormones, and almost 19% of them contained steroids that were not listed on the label. So that's very dangerous, and we want to make sure that we kind of avoid that by choosing the right supplements. Right now, the estimate is that about 25% of supplements are contaminated with heavy metals, steroids, or medication. And what the FDA requires is that supplements are produced in a quality manner, that they are free of contaminants or impurities and accurately labeled. But the caveat there is that the manufacturer is required to test the ingredients, but there is no burden on the manufacturer to be honest about their testing, and they don't have to test every batch. So the FDA is not going in there and really checking this regularly. So it's kind of hard, we're seeing a lot of contamination and a lot of heavy metal toxicity and things like that because of this. So the other thing I want, this is a real caveat emptor, a huge buyer beware. I have so many clients who call me because I do sell supplements and say, I'd really love to buy them from you, but you're more expensive, and I can find them on Amazon for far less money. So I always tell people that if you find something that's markedly cheaper than elsewhere, you really should question why it's cheaper. I have conversations with manufacturers that I do business with, supplement supply, manufacturers, who tell me that they will not sell to certain large retailers whose names we know. And those large retailers still somehow manage to be selling that product. So the question is, where are they getting it from? Well, very often, and there was some research and some investigative journalism that looked at this. Very often they are either expired and relabeled products or absolutely simply counterfeited. And so you're not getting what you're paying for. You think you're paying for something, you're paying a cheaper price for the same product. You're actually not getting anything for your money except junk. The other thing about those large internet retailers is that you want to be able to track the source of your item. So if you buy it from someone directly, then you can say, if you have a problem with the item, you can call them up, contact them and say, this was the problem, I either want my money back, I want a replacement, etc. These big internet retailers who work through third-party retailers are not responsible for the quality of anything somebody ships through them. So it's okay when you buy a book, if the book maybe has, a ripped page, but if you're buying a supplement, you want to make sure that it is actually what it should be and that you could track down the person who ultimately sold it to you. And the question is, if the manufacturer, as I said, if I have worked with manufacturers who say they don't sell to the retailer, you have to wonder how they're getting that product and question its quality. So the other thing that's important, if we're buying from a safe source, and we know that we're not using a large online retailer or something off the back of a truck, then we need to know about third-party verification, which means this is, again, something optional. The third-party verification is having another organization come in and test your product and verify that you are following the appropriate procedures. And the reason that's good is because when people manufacture something and then test in-house, they often are biased to find a positive response to the test. And so when you have a third-party organization coming in, there's more objectivity and there's more transparency in what's happening. Often these require payment to a verifying organization. The manufacturer will sign up for them and they will come in and do their verifications. And these are some of the names you might see on a bottle of supplements, U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and there's two different things. You might see USP or you might see USP verified. USP verified implies that they have actually been verified by the USP, and it's not just, they just haven't signed off to actually follow those, but they've actually signed up to be tested and to be observed and have somebody come into their facility and review. ConsumerLabs also does verification, as does NSF. Non-GMO project verified is great if you're concerned about GMOs, and I'm seeing that on a lot more of the natural products that I use. So one of the things about the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, which is one of the most common ones you'll see, is that when you see, as I said, just the certification mark, it just says the products contain the supplements listed on the label in the amounts that are stated and that it's manufactured properly. But it doesn't speak to the safety or efficacy of the ingredients. There's nobody really going in and doing a walkthrough on it in the same way. So you may see some of these seals on packaging, and it's good if you do see them, but they are not enough because you really want to know a little more about your supplements. So far, on the one hand, ConsumerLab did an evaluation of 20 multivitamins. Now, anybody can sign up to join ConsumerLab and review these results, and they test different dietary supplements all the time, so it's a nice thing to be a member of. And in this particular research study, the vitamin shot multivitamins, especially for women, was contaminated with lead. The Hero Nutritionals Yummy Bear, something I have clients who use, had twice the labeled amount of vitamin A. And again, the vitamin A may not have been a problem in that case, but if you cannot be confident that what you're buying from this manufacturer does have what it says at the levels that it says, you don't know what else could be wrong there too, from batch to batch even. Nature's Plus, especially for you as women, did not disintegrate in the time it should, and the reason that's a problem is because very often if it doesn't disintegrate on time, you end up excreting part of it. So you're not getting what it says on the label because you haven't been able to absorb it. So again, we see a number of different items and how they were evaluated by ConsumerLabs. But the other thing is, these are four items that ConsumerLabs passed because they did have what they said on the label. They did meet the requirements that ConsumerLabs said. But in terms of my perception and my evaluation of a product, having what it says on the label is just the beginning. So for example, one of the things that passed ConsumerLabs test, the Flintstones Complete, was this multivitamin for children. Yet it contains FD&C Yellow 6 and Lake Blue and Carmine and all these different colors and other additives, things like sodium benzoate and citric acid, which in some cases may be problematic. Some supplements I use do have those, but for some people they are problematic and need to be at least investigated. So just because a supplement is ConsumerLab stamped, that doesn't mean it's going to meet our high quality standards for hypoallergenicity and no artificial ingredients, and those are things that I would set as standards for the things that we look at. So when you're looking at a label, you want to look and make sure that the daily dosage is on there. You want to make sure that you look at the ingredients and identify fillers and allergens. You want to make sure it has a lot number on it, because if there's a problem with the product, you want to be able to call the manufacturer and say, this is the lot number. And a good manufacturer is going to be able to go back to that, take that lot number, go back, look at the testing that was done on that specific lot, and even very often pull a sample off the shelf of that lot and test it again to make sure there's no problem. Hopefully there's an expiration date. Now I will be very honest, very often the things last much longer than their expiration dates, but we like to make sure that we know when they were produced and when they were going to expire so we don't buy expired product. And then you want to make sure they are following good manufacturing practices, USP, ConsumerLab, etc. And then compare prices, but compare them from reputable suppliers. Don't compare them from those large internet suppliers. We also, this is something very important for people who are integrative in their approach and for kids on the spectrum. We want to make sure they're free of common allergens. Things like vitamin C, maybe corn-based. Citric acid is often corn-based, so we want to make sure that if those are problems for somebody, we know that and we're avoiding or finding a different source. You can buy vitamin C that's cassava-based or beet-based. It doesn't have to be corn-based, but it most commonly is. And that's something you want to know. Soy lecithin is also used as an emulsifier in many products, and for those kids that are soy sensitive, some may tolerate soy lecithin, others may not. So it's something that you want to play around with. It doesn't mean you absolutely can't use it, but you want to be careful with it. You also want to find out if there's any dairy or yeast substrates in the product, because those are also very commonly used. And then we want to look at fillers, things like magnesium stearate, which can have a tough effect on the gut for those who are gut compromised, and things like rice starch. So anybody on the specific carbohydrate diet should not be using supplements that have rice starch or other starches in them, and those are often used as fillers, even in very natural, very good quality products. So it also matters what diet your child is on. The other thing that matters is what form is the nutrient in, and there's so much information and so many different options in terms of the form. So for example, I'm not going to go into all the details of the difference between folate, folinic, and 5-methyltetrahydrofolate, but hopefully many of you know that there are differences, and if not, it's something you want to explore. Now, folic acid, just to be specific, is the synthetic form of folate. Folate is what we get from food, and it is the least broken down form of folate. As our bodies process it, it turns into folinic, and then it goes to 5-MTHF. So those of us who have 5-MTHFR polymorphisms are not going to be as effective at utilizing folate to make our 5-MTHF, so we want a product that has 5-MTHF. And very often it's just more easily absorbed and is more available in these higher doses that we want therapeutically. For vitamin E, mixed tocopherols versus alpha tocopherol. Most commonly, and some of the cheaper supplements have only alpha, whereas mixed tocopherols are more what's found in nature, and so some of the more natural and professional line supplements will use mixed tocopherols. There's also a difference, and there's a little, the D should be down on the next line. There's a difference between the D versus the DL form. Alpha tocopherol can come either as D or DL, and the D is the natural form, the DL is the synthetic. So again, when you're looking at that supplement, you just don't want to necessarily say how much vitamin E is in there, but what is the form of the vitamin E? And again, niacin versus niacinamide, for example. One is very good for heart disease, but also exacerbates flushing. So depending on what your issue is, there are different forms of the same nutrient that may be better or worse. B6 versus P5P is another thing many people ask me about. P5P is the more active form. You need less of it, but it's also more expensive. So depending on what somebody's absorption issues are, you may decide to go with one or the other. In terms of calcium, we want to think about the form of calcium. Calcium carbonate is the cheapest form. It's the most commonly found, very widely available, but it's also poorly absorbed and slow to be digested. And citrate is a more effective form and more easily digested and utilized, better absorption. The other thing about calcium is, do you take it as a single, just a straight calcium supplement, or do you combine it with things like magnesium and vitamin D, which are necessary for absorption and utilization? So usually a combination product of calcium, magnesium, D may include boron, may include zinc, a few other items, but those are the things that vitamin K is also helpful. You want your calcium supplement to be something that is going to be absorbed well and utilized well, and it requires these other cofactors to do that. Magnesium is another one that has many, many functions, and depending on what that function is, you're going to choose different sources. What is the purpose? Is it calming? Are you using magnesium as a laxative? Are you helping with muscle soreness? In any of these cases, for calming, you may want to use a taurate form. However, for a laxative effect, you may want to use citrate. Now, magnesium glycinate actually is kind of sweet tasting for kids who just need a loading dose of magnesium, and it's hard to get some of these supplements in. Using something like magnesium glycinate can enhance the taste and maybe facilitate better intake. So there's all kinds of different little things you can know about the form of these supplements. The other thing people hear a lot about is chelated minerals. And chelated minerals are those that are combined with some sort of amino acid. So for example, magnesium taurate, zinc aspartate, things like that are chelated with an amino acid. And there is evidence that those are more bioavailable and better utilized. The other thing that's important is proprietary blends or formulations that have been used in research. So for example, if you go on PubMed or you go on another website where you can look at research papers, you will find that Tishcon is a company that makes something called Q-Gel or Hydro-Q-Zorb. form of CoQ10, and those have been used in studies and show good availability and good absorption. Pharmanac is another one where there are multiple studies that show efficacy of that specific particular brand and formulation of N-acetylcysteine. The same is true for quatrefolik, and in terms of curcumin, both Mariva and BCM95 are different forms of curcumin, but they've both been tested and both show good efficacy. So sometimes it is important to know if you're using a cheaper form of CoQ10, for example, it may not be as bioavailable as a form that's been tested and maybe slightly more expensive, and that's something that you have to balance in your choices. The other thing that's important is testing the raw materials, and this is not something that you would do, obviously, but you want to know that your manufacturer, the person who is the source of your supplements, is testing their raw materials, that they have the strength and potency that they should have, that they are heavy metal, pesticide, or solvent contamination free, and it is very, very common for herbs that come from China to be contaminated with heavy metals and pesticides. So you have to be very careful about things like that. In addition, supplements especially, many of the herbs can be contaminated with funguses or molds, other microbial contamination, and that's something we need to guard against. They can be rancid, or they can have GMOs or other environmental pollutants. So good quality, clean product is really important. And again, a good quality manufacturer is going to be testing those things. They are going to know where the raw materials come from and have proof of testing of the batches to show that they are clean and good quality. They are also going to test every lot and make those tests available to somebody who wants to look at them, to verify those label claims and to make sure that the finished product did meet those claims. Very often a sample from each lot is archived, so again, they can pull it off the shelf. You want to make sure the retailer can be identified and make sure that there's proof of stability testing so that it maintains its strength throughout its expiration date. So in terms of botanicals, that's another area. Again, the raw materials are really, really important there. But you also want to know the botanical name of the product. So for example, people talk about ginseng, but there's Siberian ginseng and there's American ginseng, and they're very, very different items. And they have very different effects. Now, one of the other things about all herbs and botanicals is that there are different parts of the plant that can be used, and they will have different levels of efficacy. So you want to know that the part of the plant you're using is the part that was studied as the active component. It might be a root, might be a leaf, might be the rhizome, which is kind of like the stem. But you want to make sure that you're using the right form. And you want to make sure that the concentration botanical is where it should be. So another thing that comes up when you're choosing supplements is, and I just always throw this in about supplements, even though it has less to do with actual choice, but how do you schedule them? So is this something that should be taken with meals or between meals? For example, amino acids are often best taken between meals, whereas there are other things. I find probiotics, some manufacturers will say with, some will say between, so I usually just follow the manufacturer's recommendations on that. Personally, I get nauseous if I don't take a probiotic with food, so I make sure that I do. But there are some manufacturers who do recommend theirs are taken between meals. You want to know about AM or PM dosing. So, for example, with B-complex, it can increase activity. That's something that's probably generally best taken in the morning because you don't want it to keep somebody awake at night. And which things can be combined. So, for example, if your child is on a course of antibiotics, you do not want to be giving probiotics with the antibiotics. The antibiotics will kill the probiotics. You've wasted your money and your time. But you may take them at a different time of day, and certainly once you're done with the antibiotics, you want to boost those probiotics aggressively. Things like iron and vitamin C. Vitamin C enhances iron absorption, so it's important to take those together. And it doesn't have to be a supplement. You can take an iron supplement with some strawberries or with an orange, but you want to potentiate its absorption by using vitamin C. And these are some of the most common nutrient deficiencies we see in kids on the spectrum. And I've talked about a lot of these items in terms of knowing which type of product is best, which formulation. So calcium, very, very important because we know most of our kids are dairy-free, and we really need to make sure we're using a good form of calcium. In terms of vitamin D, the D3 form is the most easily absorbed and utilized, so that's the form that you want to be using. Magnesium, as I said, comes in many forms, and the choice of that depends on what you're using it for. Our omega-3s, the reason we want to be concerned about omega-3s is because fish is so toxic in many ways that you want to make sure you're getting it from a highly reputable company that tests for omega-3 fatty acids to a level of parts per trillion is my preference. Some U.S. companies only test parts per million, whereas many of the Norwegian companies test in parts per trillion. So you've got incredible purity in those products, and they're very safe. Zinc, B12, folate, all of those come in various forms, and it's good to learn about which ones may be most effective or why you might need them. So I did want to address also the difference between what we call the DRI, the daily reference intake, versus a therapeutic dose, because many people look on the label and they say, oh my gosh, I can't take this. It has 2,000% of the DRI. Now the DRI was designed almost a century ago to, well, the RDAs at that point, to basically avoid deficiency diseases, which is what people in the United States used to suffer from, scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, because they weren't eating well-balanced diets. And so we had, this was basically the minimum amount that most of the population needed to consume in order to avoid a deficiency. It was never designed to address a therapeutic or optimal dose for healing purposes. In addition, it was designed for the general population. It was not designed for a sick population or those with maldigestion or oxidative stress or other diseases that waste their nutrients and require them to need more. So although it is very important to know toxicity levels, the DRIs are not necessarily the guide that is most effective for determining whether your supplement has enough in it. But that being said, we also want to make sure that we consider pediatric dosing, because pediatric dosing is not always the same as adult dosing. It's often not the same at all. And if you're using an adult product, you need to determine the appropriate dose. Some rules of thumb, but they don't apply to everything, so it's important to know specifically about the product. You may often use a third of the adult dose, but it may also be based on weight. It can be based on clinical judgment, but you want to really know toxicity levels for children if you're using many of these things before you start to introduce them. So one of the things I also wanted to talk about is drug supplement nutrient interactions, because this is where the whole story of supplements can become complicated, and you want to make sure that when you're supplementing effectively. So for example, most people don't realize that antifungals are pH dependent. So when you're taking some sort of acid suppressor, Zantac or Prevacid, etc., the antifungals may not be as effective as they should be. In addition, antifungals deplete nutrients like magnesium and potassium, and ketoconazole inhibits the synthesis of vitamin D. So those are things you want to think about when you're on antifungal, and talk to whatever practitioner you work with to make sure that all of those things are being supported. For anyone who's taking corticosteroids, which are commonly prescribed for asthma, we know that long-term use may stunt growth and cause bone loss, but in addition, in the shorter term, it can deplete calcium, vitamin D, selenium, phosphorus, and lower glucose levels. So it's important to know those things. Valproic acid, which is Depakote, it's anti-seizure medication, has a major calcium-reducing effect, and also reduces folic acid, L-carnitine, niacinamide, selenium. So very, very important, especially if you've got kids who have mitochondrial issues. It's extremely important that their carnitine is supported, that their folate is supported, and for obvious reasons we need to make sure that they're getting adequate calcium. I mentioned the acid suppressors in regard to antifungals, but in addition, they really waste B12. Pepsid, Zantac, Nexium all waste B12, and Nexium also wastes magnesium. And you'll see a lot of the same nutrients being affected over and over again. So when you're taking many of these medications, it's often a good idea just to have a good multivitamin on board. And the reason I put oral contraceptives in is not because I think we have any kids on the spectrum right now who are taking oral contraceptives, except for potentially our adult clients, but for moms. If you're taking oral contraceptives, you are wasting your folic acid, your magnesium, and some of the other B vitamins as well. So it's really important that you're supporting those at good quality levels after you stop taking them if you plan to become pregnant. Before you become pregnant, you should replete your B vitamin levels. So again, antibiotics will deplete. Obviously, they'll deplete our good flora. And with that may come a host of problems, so you want to replenish with probiotics. But they will also have an effect on calcium, magnesium, other minerals such as manganese and zinc, biotin, potassium, vitamin C and K, and all your Bs. Essential fatty acids have very little negative effect. The thing that I do caution against is that they do reduce platelet aggregation. So just as a cautionary thing, if there's any surgery happening, I usually recommend my clients stop the fish oil about a week before, just to make sure that there's not any problem with excess bleeding. And again, probiotics and prebiotics. We want to make sure that we take them at a different time of day from our antibiotics. They help increase production of B vitamins. So again, that's something probiotics are going to support the counterbalance the depletion of some of the other medications that waste those B vitamins. Now, I just always write this down as kind of a cover yourself thing. There have been 9 reported cases of fungal infections after the use of Saccharomyces boulardii, but this is only in people who had prior severely impaired immune function. So I don't really worry about it too much. I've never, nor has anybody I work with or any of my colleagues ever seen anybody have a problem with Saccharomyces boulardii, but there are 9 reported cases in the literature. So I like to inform. In terms of B vitamins, long-term use of NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, will deplete your B vitamins. And folate, B1, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin are affected. You always want to take B1, B2, and B3. Ideally, they should be taken together because they work best together. They do enhance the action of antidepressants. So that's a nice thing for support if you're taking antidepressants. And when you're taking antibiotics, you want to make sure you take them, but at a different time. Some of the other B vitamins, B6, enhances magnesium uptake. Those two are really nicely taken together. You want to be careful about your dosing and not get too excessive. B12 also can be supportive with your acid suppressors, antidepressants, and antibiotics, but they are depleted by seizure medications and antibiotics. So you really want to push B12 when you're taking antibiotics. And reflux medications will also reduce absorption, so it's very important to support those B12 levels. Biotin is another one. You can see what it says here. So in terms of antioxidants, vitamin C, we know it has a laxative effect. That may be a good thing or not a good thing, so you want to be careful with your dosing. It also can be very supportive with certain antipsychotic medications, but it can also increase oxalates. So depending on what your individual child's profile is, you have to think about all of these things when you're deciding how much, whether to use vitamin C and how much. Vitamin E is depleted by anticonvulsants and may need some support. Selenium, depleted by valproic acid again. And glutathione, I hope you all know, is depleted by acetaminophen. I do not recommend Tylenol or other forms of acetaminophen in general because they do have a negative effect on glutathione, and most of our kids are already suffering from inadequate levels of active forms of glutathione. In terms of minerals, calcium. This is a couple of takeaway points about calcium. They impair antibiotic intake, so you should not take calcium with your antibiotic, but you should take it with magnesium and D, as I mentioned before. Magnesium can cause diarrhea. It can bind antibiotics. So again, if you're taking your calcium and magnesium together, take them away from your antibiotics. And zinc will compete with some of these other minerals, and that's why sometimes it's nice to take calcium, magnesium with zinc so you can support them all together. Now, for those children or adults who require mitochondrial support, you should know that carnitine, as I've mentioned, is depleted by valproic acid, by Depakote. So you want to make sure that you're reinforcing that because carnitine is critically essential for mitochondrial function. So if anti-seizure medication is reducing carnitine levels in someone who requires mitochondrial support, they really need to have that added. In addition to which, CoQ10 is depleted by tricyclic antidepressants and antipsychotics. So if you have a child on any of those and they have mitochondrial issues, you want to make sure you're supporting those adequately. In terms of vitamin A and D, vitamin A actually has a synergistic effect with iron, so your iron, your C, and your A can all go together. It is considered a teratogen, which means that it can cause birth defects. There's a lot of conflicting information about whether it is truly a teratogen or not, and I am not sure that I believe that it is. But for caution's sake, we do not want to overdo vitamin A during pregnancy. In terms of vitamin D, it's very supportive with antidepressants, but it will be depleted by stimulant laxatives and anticonvulsants. So here's a few of the amino acids that we use frequently. Taurine will also reduce platelet aggregation. So again, before surgery, good idea to stop taking taurine. It can also lower blood sugar, and that may or may not be a good thing, so be careful. And GABA will have an additive effect with anti-anxiety meds, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You may be able to take less of their anti-anxiety meds. But if you just layer GABA on top of pre-existing anti-anxiety medication, you may find that the effect is too much. And with 5-HTP, there is something called serotonin syndrome, and that's just a caution to be careful of that because it can be dangerous. And 5-HTP actually may improve seizure activity. Now, let's talk a little bit about antimicrobials, because I know many of us take them for many reasons, and they all have wonderful effects, but they also have some effects you should be aware of. So, for example, garlic will enhance the effect of blood thinners. If you're taking fish oil and you're taking garlic, and you're taking taurine, you want to be careful about those blood thinning effects if you have to have surgery of any kind. It can also lower blood sugar, so if anybody is taking diabetic medications, you should be careful about that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't take it, it just means you should be aware and cognizant of what the signs might be of low blood sugar. Cat's claw is very protective against GI damage from those nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, but you do want to avoid it with potent immunosuppressants. It does have antiplatelet effects, and it can be nephrotoxic, so people who have renal dysfunction, I generally don't use cat's claw. Now, in terms of oil of oregano, if you're allergic to anything in the family, mint, sage, thyme, basil, marjoram, you would want to stay away from that. Otherwise, it's a really great and effective antimicrobial. Cinnamon is wonderful for lowering blood sugar. I use it a lot with my diabetic clients, but it can also reduce platelet aggregation, and you just want to be aware of those two facts. Now, uva ursi is another very, very helpful, potent antimicrobial, and I've used it effectively many, many times, but it should only be used in short term. It does have some hepatotoxic effects, and so you want to be careful when you use it. I know many people who've used it successfully with children, but you do want to be very careful. And again, with spironolactone, you do not want to use uva ursi. Golden seal and berberine are also wonderful antimicrobials. They can increase stomach acid. So I actually think that's often a very good thing. And I hope a lot of you are aware that very often when you have reflux, it's because you have too little acid as opposed to too much. So the whole point of taking acid suppressors may not be working in you or your child's favor. But if you're taking some sort of acid suppressor, if you're taking golden seal and berberine, they may be working at cross purposes. They do reduce the effects of tetracycline, but they improve insulin resistance. So you also, again, want to be careful if you're taking diabetic meds or your children are taking diabetic medication. It's just going to change their response. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but you have to be cognizant of it. Pycnogenol is another herb I use a lot that I like, and it does have some antimicrobial properties, but it can also lower blood sugar and reduce platelet aggregation. And it can also reduce histamine release. People use it for allergies, and that can often be a very good thing. So in terms of anti-inflammatories, curcumin, if you have an allergy to ginger or yellow food coloring, you do want to be careful with it. And quercetin can be nephrotoxic in very high doses, so that's something to be aware of. And as for the gut healers, the mucilaginous herbs, such as slippery elm, marshmallow, and deglycyrrhizinates and licorice, all SCD illegal. There's nothing wrong with them, but if your child is on an SCD diet, these are not the things that you necessarily want to be using. And hopefully their gut is healing anyway. But I just want to point out that these are not SCD legal, although it would seem that if you have a child who has gut problems, they might want to take these. Melatonin is another interesting product that I use frequently and is very, very helpful in many ways. But we know that there's some interaction with SSRIs and melatonin, and that it can also reduce platelet aggregation. So you want to just be a little careful with it. And in terms of enzymes, proteolytic enzymes will inhibit folate absorption. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, just give them at a different time from when you give your folate so that your folate absorption can be optimized. And activated charcoal, the only concern I always say about that one is make sure that you take it 2 hours away from anything else because it will absorb everything. So if you give it with a handful of supplements, all those supplements were generally wasted because the activated charcoal will absorb them and you will excrete them or your child will excrete them. So some of the takeaway points that we're talking about today is just to understand that manufacturers of dietary supplements do not have to demonstrate safety or effectiveness. The quality of supplements can really vary very widely. So we want to make sure that we know where our supplements are coming from. Third-party testing, as I said, is important. It's absolutely essential. It's critical, but it is not sufficient. Because again, you can third-party test and say that those Flintstone vitamins were great because they met those requirements, but they don't meet our requirements. They don't meet our requirements for hypoallergenicity, for lack of artificial ingredients, for many, for the purity of the product that we are really looking for in the autism population. You also want to know the appropriate form of the nutrient or the botanical, learn about interactions and depletions, know how to dose and schedule it, and ideally you want to find a knowledgeable practitioner who's going to help you navigate all this because it is pretty much a lot to navigate on your own. And I obviously strongly suggest that you work with a practitioner who understands this.
Okay, great. Yep, we've got some questions here, and I'll be reading these to you, and then you can answer. So okay. Here's the very first one. Are the supplement fillers like magnesium, I'm not going to be able to read this, but magnesium butyrate, harmful? Are they harmful?
Are they harmful? That's a really good question. Generally, magnesium stearate is considered safe, and it's used in a lot of supplements as a filler, but there is evidence that it disrupts intestinal integrity. So again, I do use it because it is harder to find supplements without it that meet all my other requirements, but when I can avoid it, I do. So I am concerned about magnesium stearate, but I am not concerned to the point where I will not use it.
Okay, great. The next one is, how do you know which supplements should not be taken together or which ones should be taken together? Now, you talked about that a bit, but maybe
Right.
do you have any high-level guidelines? I mean, do people just need to give something every hour, or what's the best way for a parent?
No. The high-level guideline is, there's actually a couple of things. If you Google basically drug-nutrient interactions or nutrient, supplement interactions, there are a number of websites that actually have some of that information. Now, there are some that are available to me as a practitioner that aren't available to the general population, but you can look at something like Natural Medicine's Comprehensive Database. That's a great resource. Now, again, they do provide more information to practitioners, but they do have a consumer-level website as well. And you can go on those types of websites and look at drug-nutrient interactions or supplement interactions. And it will tell you things like what depletes what and what to take together. And the other thing is, honestly, I think that part of that is what you want your practitioner to know and rely on them to help you with.
Okay, great. This is a really good one, this next one. It's one that a lot of families face, I think. It says, my autistic child can't chew and can't swallow capsules. Is it a problem to open or crush the capsules and put the content in food? Is some potency lost? Is something better than nothing?
That is a really great question. And the answer is it depends. There are certain supplements that cannot be opened because once they're opened and exposed to air, they may become oxidized, or it may be that they can't make it through the digestive tract if they're not in their encapsulated form. They're not protected that way. So for some supplements, you can easily open them. For others, not so much. The manufacturer can tell you that, and again, I can tell my clients that, but it's not like one easy answer. So there are some that you can, some that you can't. I'm going to tell you a little hint though, and this may not work for everybody. I know there are many kids who just simply can't take supplements, but one of the things most people don't tell you, and I usually explain this, and I don't know if you still have the visual of me, but tablets sink and capsules float. Most of the time, we give people, ourselves or our children, a handful of supplements, whatever, and they put it in their mouth, and then they put their head back so they can help, so it can go down their throat, and then they drink. The problem is that capsules float. So when you put your head back, the capsules actually float to the roof of your mouth, and they're harder to get down your throat. The ideal thing to do with a capsule is actually put it in your mouth, take some fluid, and then actually try to tuck your chin to your chest. And as you put your head down, the capsule will float to the back, towards your ears, to the back of your throat. And then if you simply swallow, they often go down without a problem. So that's a little hint that might help a lot of people who are trying to get their kids to swallow capsules, because it goes down so much easier that you barely notice it. And if you start with little tiny ones, often they can do that much better than you expect. The other thing I usually recommend is that you start them early trying to swallow capsules, because many kids can do it earlier than we think they can. But if they can't, then yes, you have to basically, one of the other things I often recommend is I get very concerned with parents who mix a lot of supplements in food, because then kids who are already picky eaters may become even more picky. So I usually recommend taking something, I don't care what it is, applesauce, butternut squash, pureed carrots, peas, broccoli, whatever, and kind of make that a medicine vehicle. Mix everything you can in there. Give it once, twice, 3 times a day, whatever. But whenever they see the pureed broccoli coming, they know that that's their medicine. So they're actually getting probably 6-8 tablespoons of broccoli a day, which is not a big deal, which is a good thing. But they're also not having it on their plate and not saying, well, what's mom hiding in my food, or what's dad hiding? So I do recommend you find a food that is no longer a food, it's just a medicine vehicle, but something that you want your kids to eat, and use that to get the medicine in.
Okay, the next one. How to tell if a supplement is not helping, or if it's making it worse, or if it's causing harm. How can you evaluate the efficacy or the safety for your particular child?
Another fabulous question, and it's really hard to do when you have 17 balls in the air. So as hard as it is, the recommendations are always, at least my recommendations are always one thing at a time, 3 to 4 days in between, to at least see if there's some kind of acute reaction to something that you've tried. And if you see that there's something going on, I would recommend stopping it. But an expression my husband uses is basically one data point doesn't make a line, which means if you start something and something happens and you stop it and it goes away, you still don't know if that's what caused it. You want to start again one more time, see if the reaction happens again. And if you continue to have that reaction the second time, then you can be pretty sure that it was the supplement you gave and you should stop it. And the other thing I think is it's very important to keep data so that you know that this is, when you go back and you think about what happened, if you see improvements or you see problems, you can look back and say, this is the day I started, and since that day or since 2 days later, these are the behaviors that started happening, and try to work it back. But it is complex.
Okay, the next question. What are your thoughts on companies that are FDA registered? Are they good enough in terms of quality supplements? Does that make them superior in some way?
FDA registered?
Yeah.
I don't quite know what that means. I mean, the FDA oversees dietary supplements. They are the regulating body, but they don't test or do any, like I said, they don't do any pre-market testing or any kind of evaluation. The law basically says that it's up to the manufacturer to do that, which is why I think the important thing to do is make sure they're following good manufacturing principles, they are certified with some sort of third-party verification, but that you also have done your legwork, because that third-party verification isn't enough. You've done your legwork to know how much testing they're doing. Are they testing the raw materials? Are they testing their finished batches? Are they keeping those batches on file so they can go back and check them and make sure that they are testing to levels that are appropriate? So for example, fish oils they use something called a TOTOX. It's a total toxin test. And the TOTOX score is something that tells you how contaminated that fish oil may be. A good fish oil manufacturer should be able to give you the TOTOX score of whatever batch. Now again, I don't expect you to call every time you order a batch of fish oil, but if you know that that company is willing to give you the TOTOX score and let you know the results of their quality testing, then you can be pretty comfortable it's a good company. If the company will not disclose that information, you do need to wonder why.
So I've had a lot of questions about specific brands and reliable brands.
Right. Am I allowed to say that stuff?
Well, I think the best thing to do might be to help them see how you select the brands. So how do you pick? Like because you look at all these different supplements, and I'm guessing that they change over time. So when you're thinking about the supplements that you keep like in your clinic, how do you
Right. How do I choose them?
Yep.
Well, one thing I don't do is and this is another thing, and some manufacturers, some practitioners do this, and I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with it, but I don't stick with one manufacturer. I don't believe any one manufacturer makes everything the best. So I do try to pick and choose. I look at, first thing is, am I willing to buy, and again, it's kind of this top-down approach. Am I willing to even buy from this manufacturer? Do I think that their quality standards are enough? Are they doing the things I said? Are they doing third-party testing? Do they have information available to me about what those testing results are? Are the reps willing to answer my questions whenever I have them in terms of something? I've had clients call me and say, I opened a bottle of something and it smelled funny. I called the manufacturer and said, look, my client says it smells funny, it's lot X, blah, 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 can you check it? They go back, they look at the paperwork, they pull the bottle off the shelf that they have in their warehouse, they retest it, they tell me it's okay or no, tell them to send it back, we'll replace it. That's a good quality manufacturer. So I will only use those. Then I look at what is the form of the product. Do they have the form of the product I need? So I may like the magnesium citrate of one company, but the dose on another company's product is too low and my client needs to take too many pills. So it may be as simple as that. This one is a higher potency and I like it better. I look at what the excipients are. So for example, there's one company that I can think of top of mind who is a great, very high quality company, but they use a lot of rice starch in their products. So I tend to use less of their products because I have too many clients who do SED or other low carb types of diets and I don't want them getting rice starch when they don't need it. There's no point. And certainly if they're SED, I don't want them getting it at all. So then I'll also look at the form. So again, if it's a kid with constipation versus a kid who needs to be calming, do I want them taking magnesium taurate or magnesium citrate? Which of my manufacturers offers the dose I want with the least excipients, that's hypoallergenic, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's how I kind of look at it. And if I know a client needs a number of things, I'll see if I can find a manufacturer that makes a combination that works really well, so they don't have to take as many pills. So I kind of look at all those things. And to be honest with you, there's not one perfect calcium supplement. I mean, there's 20, 30, 40. There are many manufacturers who make a high-quality calcium supplement, and it really doesn't make as big a difference as long as you're starting with that select group of manufacturers who we know are good quality. And as long as we know that whatever the excipients are in that product are something we can live with for our individual child, then, you know, those things are pretty easy. When it comes to certain other things, for example, like the CoQ10, I do tend to use hydrocortisone, or when it comes to NAC, I do often, you know, some of these trademarked or registered products that have been used in research studies where I can follow that research, those are the ones I'll tend to select. For example, quatrefolate.
Okay. We have a couple other really good questions here. The first one, what kind of professional do I need to hire to guide me through regarding proper supplementation?
So of course I'm a dietitian. I would say a dietitian or a qualified nutritionist, because I think many of your physicians may be great at this, but they also may be busier and may not have as much time to go through it in this level of detail. But I think a dietitian / nutritionist could do a really good job with that.
Okay. The next question is about, are any manufacturers under legal obligation to notify customers if there's a problem with a batch?
You know, that's a good question, and I actually don't know the answer to that. I know that I have been notified by manufacturers. My understanding is that the manufacturer needs to notify the retailer, and the retailer is then charged with notifying the buyer. Because really the manufacturer has no idea who bought their product. Like if they sell it to me and I sell it to somebody else, the manufacturer has no idea who I sold it to, so they communicate the information to me, and then it's my responsibility to communicate it to my clients.
Okay. So what is your opinion on supplements that are compounded at a pharmacy?
Compounded supplements can be fantastic. You know, and that's something I didn't even bring up here because I didn't really have a lot of time, but aside from the possible expense, which can be a negative, compounding is wonderful because you can get exactly what you want in the product. You can choose which combinations, you can choose the forms, you can avoid excipients that aren't good for you. You can often get a more concentrated product, so I love compounders. But again, your compounder has to be as reputable as your manufacturer, and there are some that are, and there are some that are not. And that's a story for another day, but there are many, many excellent quality compounders, and then there are many that are not safe. So you need to know your compounder. The other thing about compounding, which sometimes helps, is that if you can actually, if there's a medication that's needed, and you can get some of the nutrients compounded with that medication, the insurance will pay for it, whereas if there's no medication involved, the insurance won't pay for the compounding, and it can be expensive.
Okay, I think we've got time for just a couple more. The first one I've got here is, how do you find out the information that you listed under what is a good supplement? So they're referring back to your slide. They're asking, how do you get all that? Where do you go look? Is it all on the internet, or what's the best thing to do?
Yeah, good question. A lot of work. There are Herbalgram and, like I said, Natural Comprehensive, I can't remember, I just said it, Natural Standards Comprehensive Database is the one I use most often. There are a number of different companies, and I can actually post some links to some of those. But the Botanical Council, there's many, many organizations, professional organizations that will post some information about this stuff, but there's really no one place where you're going to get everything. So you do have to do some investigative work.
Okay, this is a good slide to end, or a good question to end on. It says, I know that you had a slide on the supplements that may be helpful for some persons with autism. Without having to take a boatload of supplements, what would be the top supplements you would recommend based on your clinical experience?
Okay, so That's probably the question I get asked most commonly and the hardest one I have to answer, because if I don't know your individual child, I don't know what they need. You know, for a child who's eating a really great diet, I might not say they need a multivitamin. For a kid who's not eating a good diet, I would definitely say they do. A hypoallergenic, autism-specific, you know, high B type of multi. So in general, if we were to assume this was a population of kids who had poor eating habits and were while we know there's no typical autism, we have to assume that if there was a typical autism, it would be, for me, probiotics, fish oil, and a multivitamin. A good quality multivitamin which has, again, the effective form of folate, the quatrefolate form, the 5-MTHF. It would have the right kind of vitamin D and vitamin E. Make sure that all of that B vitamins in the adequate doses that they need for therapeutic effect. So that would be my starting point for most people. But then we get into the whole, do they have mitochondrial issues and blah, 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 and then it gets even more complicated. But if I were really to be forced to go to a baseline, a good multi, a probiotic, and an essential fatty acid.